Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude. The ongoing trade standoff between the U.S. and China is beginning to cause considerable alarm across the world, particularly amongst economists and analysts who see this as the start of another Cold War. But more importantly, if both the U.S. and China continue to dig their heels in, this could eventually have implications for the global economy and might even lead to a recession. But the recent meeting between President Trump and President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the G20 summit has given a ray of hope, with Mr. Trump calling it an amazing and productive meeting, and the Chinese side also stating that it was very positive and constructive. To look at what were the key issues and how it would impact on the world economy and what are the implications for India, we have two experts. We have Ambassador Sajjan Har with us. Welcome once again on the show, sir. An ambassador has been our diplomatic representative in many key capitals of the world, but also more importantly, negotiated for India in the WTO and is currently the head and the president of the Institute of Global Studies in Delhi. And we have Mr. Abhijit Das with us, who is also head of the Center of WTO at IIFT and is an important and an informed expert on trade and related issues, particularly when we look at India and its approach to global trade. I'll ask you, Ambassador Sir, the first question. It is said that it's not just about trade, it's about geopolitics, because not only has Trump been trying to put China into a corner, but most recently, the U.S. Vice President Mike Pence has even accused China of a number of things which would obviously, the Americans claim, are unethical, and it could have impact on issues ranging from politics to military affairs, with Mr. Trump also most recently suggesting, without evidence, that the Chinese were getting involved with the American elections that were taking place recently. But most importantly, what is it that America wants to achieve? Does it want to make more money out of putting more tariffs on the Chinese, or it just wants to keep the Chinese on the back foot and not let China's so-called Vision 2025 become so big that America can't contest it a few years down the line?
You're absolutely right, Maruf, when you say that it is not purely a trade war. It is much beyond a trade war. It's also a technology war. What you mentioned, Vision 2025, which is made in China 2025, which means that China says that 90% of all the high technology will be mastered by China by 2025. In addition to that, it is also a fight for the strategic domination of the world. Let's put it, it's not only trade, because trade is the only vehicle that America can use, that Mr. Trump can use to make China toe its own line. But otherwise, if you look at the American statement that emerged out of the meeting between Trump and Xi in Buenos Aires, it says that intellectual property rights which are not being protected by China, also the forced technology transfers, that will be taken care of, and China also will import sizable quantities of agricultural products and other products. So one issue definitely is the trade deficit, because China imports just about $100 billion worth of goods from America, while it exports more than $500 billion worth. So there is a trade deficit that America has to the tune of about $400 billion every year. So one is the issue of the trade deficit, and the second is the issue of all these aspects as far as technology is concerned. One point that I'd like to make here is that what Mr. Trump says and what America has been saying is that till China became a member of the WTO in 2001, there was hardly any imbalance as far as trade. So China has misused the provisions of the WTO and gained access into the American market and into other markets while not playing by the rules and providing access to its own market. And this is what America wants to reverse, that it should import more, it should open its market more, it should give more protection to IPRs and resist in forced technology transfers.
Okay, so that's very comprehensive, the big picture, and sort of list of American grievances. But Mr. Das, I want to understand a bit more, because, you know, taking off from the point where the ambassador made, that, you know, China's exports to America are far lesser than its imports. That's the same story with India also, as far as Chinese exports to India are concerned. And that's why China has a huge trade advantage over India. And it's said that nearly 20% of Chinese exports go to the U.S. But with the recent standoff, the figures are not looking so good this year as they were at the same time last year. And I'm given to understand that now predictions about China's annual economic growth is down to about 6.3%, which is perhaps the lowest in 9 or 10 years. So, A, to understand, is it already hurting the Chinese? And B, more importantly, to understand the fact that what is it that China, in your view, was trying to achieve? The ambassador has spelled out that, you know, global dominance. But really, is China looking at global dominance as of tomorrow, or is it a long-term view between 2025 and 2050?
First things first, there's a big difference between China's trade with U.S. and China's exports to India. When we talk of Chinese exports to U.S., there is a very high component of U.S. inputs in the Chinese exports to U.S. So there is very little of Chinese value added. So if the Chinese exports to U.S. comes down, U.S. also gets hurt in turn. That is not true as far as India-China exports go.
Just a quick question, is Mr. Trump playing to the gallery? Because if he knows it hurts, then what is this trumpeting about?
He is certainly playing to the gallery partly, and as evidence of that, we are seeing murmurs and protests within his own constituencies in the United States. So true, he's been playing to the gallery, but he's trying to give out three messages. First message is, through my actions, I will bring back jobs to the Rust Belt in the United States, in the steel sector and in the other manufacturing sector. Second message is, I want to compel China to come to the negotiating table and negotiate in good faith. And the third message is for the rest of the world, which is that if you want to trade with US, if you want to access the US market, you'd better play by the rules of the game as determined by President Trump. And if in the process, US has to defy or be at default of the WTO rules, so be it. So these are the three key messages which President Trump is trying to convey to China, to his own domestic constituency, as well as to the rest of the world. Coming to what China wants to achieve, in its own documents which are in the public domain, China has said explicitly that by 2025, in respect of high technology areas, it wants to be self-reliant to the extent of 70%. And not only that, when they celebrate the centenary in 2049, then they want to be the dominant global player in high technology. That is the Chinese aspiration. And that Chinese aspiration collides head-on with the current US supremacy in the area of high technology.
Okay. So you've brought in the big strategic picture. And Ambassador, quickly, just a shorter answer here, that US has already threatened to or begun imposing CAATSA-related restrictions on China, particularly for buying military technology from Russia like the S-400. At the same time, the Chinese are also under pressure from the US to basically look at how they would be restricted in a whole lot of other areas where China is trying to sort of rule the world, from the high seas to global economy. So do you really feel that America can discipline China?
Let me put it this way. You know, what you have mentioned about CAATSA. CAATSA is really applied on Russia, Iran and North Korea. So anyone trades with these countries in sophisticated items, whether it is defense, energy, oil, gas, etc., they will come under sanctions. So it is not China specific. And also when India buys S-400, we get a waiver. China might not get a waiver and will not get a waiver. So that is the issue as far as CAATSA is concerned. As far as the other issues are concerned, you know, it is my assessment that this is not a Trumpian phenomena. It is not related to Mr. Trump. These are grievances that America has had for a long time. They have not been able to deal with it. And now people have said, irrespective of whoever might have been the president, the situation has become such that there was no other recourse that was left than to do this. And whether Mr. Trump stays in 2020 or goes away, these issues will continue to be with this U.S.-China relations.
Okay.
As we go
So again, quite clearly, this is an old grievance. This is going to continue unless China can be brought to turn around and follow the global rules of trade, as it were. But after break, we will look at the impact of this ongoing standoff on the world economy and what does it mean for India. But that after a break. Welcome back. We are looking at the ongoing U.S.-China trade standoff and its implications for both those countries, but more importantly for the world. Mr. Abhijit, it is being said by some experts that while in the near term this might not have a recession-related fallout on the world economy, but it is difficult to find how China and the U.S. can come to a common middle ground on trade, as some analysts and experts have commented. So where do you see it heading and where do you see its impact on the world economy, particularly with the IMF having already sounded the alarm bells about what it could do in the coming year or two for the world economy?
First and foremost, I would really agree with the fact that the two narratives, one of the US and second of China, they are at loggerheads. And there is very little possibility of either country keeling over or backing down despite this present grace period of 90 days. We are likely to see at least most of the problems continuing even after the 90 days. What will happen thereafter? One possibility certainly is we will see a decline in cross-border flows of investment. We will see disruption in global value chains. We are already seeing some evidence of that. We are also likely to see slowing of growth in different parts of the world, particularly those territories, those countries which are more dependent, more reliant on exports being the engine for their growth. To that extent, I think India is likely to be affected, yes, but maybe less than, let's say, countries like Japan, Korea, Singapore, where export is the real driver of the growth. So that really makes it very important for India to take steps so that the domestic demand itself is spurred, so that it in some way, it cushions the adverse impact of a global slowdown, which our exports will certainly be affected by.
Okay. So, Ambassador, sir, it's said that, President Trump and his penchant for sending out tweets by the dozen, but it's hard to make out a coherent strategy from those tweets. But one of the things his announcements have done from time to time is upset a lot of his European allies. And initially, even all of them were thinking that, here there's a man who's disrupting the global order as it had come to be and settled post-Cold War. He has recently even penalized Canada and Mexico and made them fall in line. So with all that in mind, what is it that you feel that is the message that he has for the world now? Because many of his critics in Europe have begun to suddenly see wisdom in Trump's actions when he's dealing with China.
Yeah, absolutely. You are absolutely right, Maruf, because, let me put it this way. You have very rightly said that he sort of, dictates foreign policy through his tweet messages. Now, there are all the other issues, whether it is Iran or it is transatlantic alliance or trans-Pacific partnership agreement, there is a divide within the United States between the Republicans, Democrats, and the others. His China policy is one on which all segments, whether it is Republicans, Democrats, or it is businessmen or media, they are all together with him. So this is a policy that he is going to continue. The second issue I would like to mention here is China is under much greater pressure than the United States is. And we have seen that factories and industries from China are going out into the other markets. Why do I say that? Because China can impose tariffs, punitive tariffs, only on 100 billion worth of goods that are coming from the United States, while the United States can impose punitive tariffs on all 500 billion of them. China has already exhausted itself by imposing penalty tariffs on 110 billion. United States has just imposed 250 billion, and the Chinese are feeling the pain. I agree that because of the global value chains, there are other countries also feeling the pain. But at this moment, the United States economy is growing, it's bouncing, it's collecting more tariffs, billions of dollars. So I don't think America is feeling the pain right now. It is China which is where the shoe is biting.
More so considering the fact that China's economy internally is hugely in debt, well beyond its overall GDP, as figures that have begun to come in. But you know, Mr. Trump has also called India a tariff king, and also has gone on to suggest that, you know, here is a message for many other countries, and I think we need to be reading Trump's actions and his messages clearly, because particularly in the line of what he has done with NAFTA countries and trying to discipline them, so is the Americans looking at also getting India to engage more liberally with the US, or is there a lesson for India to do something with the Chinese before they continue to overshadow everything in our economy, as they've already begun to do? So what's your take?
There's absolutely no doubt that the United States wants India to engage very proactively with it. But what it wants to extract from India is a price which may be very difficult for India to pay. And what does US want to extract from India? Intellectual property rights, so that we do not, in a way, are able to accord protection to our generic medicine. More market access for dairy products, more market access for products like wheat. Can we afford to do it? The advantage which India has compared to Mexico or Canada is that our reliance on the US as an export market is much lower than of the other two countries. So while we do want to access the US market, there's no reason for us to compromise our domestic interests to just appease the Americans. So that is a very important aspect which we need to bear in mind. As far as striking a deal with China goes, at the WTO, India and China are working very closely on certain issues, particularly agriculture, as India is also working closely with many other developing countries. I think that's the way to go forward. If we have to make sure that we are not too adversely impacted by the actions of President Trump, we have to build our alliances, we'll have to get coalitions going, we'll have to create partnership with countries like China, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, possibly Brazil, Argentina. If we fail in this endeavor, then we would find it a bit difficult to stand up to the pressures which President Trump and United States may exert on us bilaterally.
Ambassador, a last question for you. Going by what Mr. Abhijit has said, and going by the ratio of China's spread in the US market as against US goods in Chinese markets, can we do something like that to somehow come on to an equal kind of footing with the Chinese, considering they have a 2/3 to 1/3 advantage over us in terms of trade?
That is in terms of the bilateral trade
Yes.
between. I guess so, because if they are importing products from the United States and those become more expensive, I think some of those agricultural products, they could, India might be in a position to supply those. And I think in the meeting between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi in Buenos Aires, they've also discussed about exporting more rice, more sugar, more soya meal to China. But let me also make one point here, which was India-U.S. Trade relations. India's trade surplus with the United States is barely $22 billion. We were talking about $400 billion for China and $22 billion for
certainly
India.
I'm not suggesting that we confront the US on trade issues.
No, I was just making another point that in terms of managing our relations with the United States, I think it is much simpler because we can, and we have started importing. For instance, this year we are importing $4 billion worth of oil and gas from the United States. There are so many other items, aircrafts, etc., which we are willing to import from there. So I do not think that as far as our bilateral trade relations are concerned, they will be so rocky and so stormy as that is concerned. And the second is that on the policy front, what Prime Minister Modi has also mentioned about WTO is we need to engage in reformed multilateralism. There are multilateral institutions like the WTO, like the United Nations, UN Security Council, which need reform. And let us go in for negotiations for a reform with an open mind. And I think that is also the way to go forward, because all these institutions have not been able to meet the needs and aspirations of the membership.
Well, quite clearly, a number of issues are there, but most importantly, what I can understand is that trade is one thing, but trade cannot be separated from the political and the geopolitical and the diplomatic and strategic dimensions. Thank you very much for your inputs, and we'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, goodbye.